Gregory Rasputin was a drunkard. He was a horse thief. He was a seducer of young girls, and he was a general good for nothing. He was uneducated and he was illiterate. But life was grim in Russia in 1905 and things were desperate. Rasputin was from a village and he came into St. Petersburg, Russia. And he began to work his way up. And as he did, he found himself through the ranks of the nobility at the very top. In fact, he became the most trusted advisor of the Tsar, Nicholas II. And especially his very superstitious wife, the Tsarina Alex. And as he began to exert himself into that circumstance, in the fateful final years of the Romanov dynasty that had lasted over 300 years, it was said that Rasputin was the unofficial and yet undisputed ruler of Russia. He purported himself to be a prophet and a holy man, and yet he was immoral and he was unscrupulous. He had abandoned his own wife and his children. Ultimately, the Tsar and his entire large family lost their lives because they had given their control of it to him. It's amazing to me that so much control would have been given by somebody of such importance to somebody so undeserving of it. When we get to the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, it seems that Jesus' focus is on what it is that we allow to be the controller, the ruler of our lives. And the thesis of this entire sermon is found in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, where Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. What Jesus is saying is that there are choices that you have in the roadmap of life when it comes to religious things. And you can choose who or what has the control of your life. From a religious standpoint, these elitists, these scribes and Pharisees, had done something not unlike what Rasputin had done, and they had put themselves in a place of spiritual authority. You may remember in Matthew chapter 23 in verse 2 that Jesus says that they have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. They had given over control of their lives to those who, if they had continued down their road, could cause them spiritual ruin. And this becomes very important when we get to a pivotal statement that Jesus makes in the middle of this sermon. It was what was just read a moment ago in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for he'll either hate the one and love the other. He will cling to the one and despise the others. Jesus was well aware of the fact that one can place their control into that which is not worthy of it. But some of the things that Jesus mentions in this sermon are the very things that we can let control our lives, to be the ruler of our lives. And when they are measured objectively against Jesus, we'll find that all of them come hopelessly short of what Jesus provides. And so as we walk through the sermon, there's no way for us in the length of time that we have. By the way, our flight leaves at 4:53. There are already people sitting at our gate right now, and we've not even checked in for our flight. So if we leave quickly, you'll please hopefully understand that. The sermon won't go long is what I'm trying to tell you. We have time to look at 4 things, a who or what, that people put in control of their lives. Will you walk with me through the text as we look at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through Matthew chapter 7 and verse 29. I'd like for us to notice those things. Who or what is in charge of your life? Number 1, is what is in charge of your life superficial religion? Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 48. Now, as we look at Jesus' masterful introduction, which we'll get back to in just a few moments, we see that after that, Jesus begins to make some contrasts. And the contrasts are not between the law of Moses and what Jesus is teaching. It is fair for us to understand that if you measure Jesus' teaching with what the law of Moses said, the law of Moses can't compare with what Jesus comes to reveal. In fact, if you look at the Hebrews writer, he says, you lay the law alongside of Jesus, and the word that comes to the top, Hebrews chapter 8, is the word better. The Apostle Paul devotes himself at the heart of one of his letters to this idea that what Christ comes to bring is superior to what is found even in the law. Now, Paul would say if there is something that would save apart from Jesus, it would be the law. But notice the contrast here. The contrast in this text in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 48, is a contrast between what Jesus is telling them and what the scribes and Pharisees are telling them. And so there are these series of contrasts that Jesus walks through. I know that the statements that he makes when he says, it is written, or you have heard that it was said. But what he's talking about is that these scribes and Pharisees have taken things out of the old law and they have told you things that are superficial. And so you need to see that what I'm telling you goes deeper than that. You see in the text there that Jesus gives those contrasts. The contrasts are with regard to interpersonal conflict. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through verse 26, there is a contrast with regard to sexual purity. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 through 30, a contrast with regard to divorce in verse 31 and 32. There's a contrast that comes with regard to the integrity of your speech. Matthew chapter 5, verse 33 through verse 37. There's a contrast that is to be seen with regard to matters of revenge. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 through verse 42. And there's a contrast that comes with how you treat others. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 through verse 48. And Jesus says the difference is the depth to which I want to take you with regard to what I say versus what they are saying to you. Now you look at every one of the contrasts that Jesus gives, and here's essentially what they're saying. Don't you murder. But you can talk to and treat your brother any way that you want to. Hey, and don't worry about reconciling with him. Don't you commit adultery. But you can look at, you can think about, and you can objectify the object of your lust any way that you want to. You don't need to seem very casual about marriage, but if it doesn't suit your taste, then you can feel free to get out of it if you'd like. And all of these contrasts are working the same way. As Jesus speaks with regard to superficial religion, I want you to notice that he defines for us what superficial religion is. There are at least three things as we look at this question of who's going to be your ruler. Is superficial religion going to be the ruler of your life? That Jesus tells us three things. That first of all, superficial religion is that is more concerned with how you look than how you think. It's more concerned with when people are looking at your religious life. What do they see? You see, the superficial religion is more concerned with being right with others, looking right to others, than it is in being right with God. Furthermore, when you look at superficial religion, you'll see that superficial religion is that which is more concerned with the minimum than it is in going the extra mile. How many of you, where you go to church, have attendance registers? That keep up with the attendance, and they have the contribution figures. I would be happy if every one of those registers in every foyer and every auditorium were to fall off of their pegs and never be put back in place. They are not an accurate gauge of discipleship. Now, they may give an indication to us, certainly, that some people find Sunday morning more important than they do Sunday night and Wednesday night, and if so, that's a shame. And it may be an indicator that there may be some who are not giving as sacrificially as they could. And if so, that's terrible. But it really doesn't begin to give us an idea of what discipleship is. You know, it's very popular right now, especially with the millennial generation, to indulge in what's called a minimalist lifestyle. I don't know if indulge is the right word for that, but a minimalist lifestyle is about reducing space, and it's about reducing possessions and debt and stress. And the idea, there's websites everywhere on how to live life more simply. And I think it does give us insight into how to have a better relationship with our money. But so often we take a minimalist approach when it comes to our relationship with God. I'm going to reduce my time. I'm going to reduce my emotion. I'm going to reduce my effort, my overall commitment to Christ. And then sometimes, though, what happens is we're not really reducing. We're just changing the object of our loyalty. I'm going to increase my time in my hobbies and in my entertainment and with my children's activities and with my work. When we see what Jesus is calling for here, the ones that do the minimum versus going for this maximum effort that goes inside out, as one of the earlier speakers said, what Jesus is focusing our attention on is that he wants his followers to be doing more for him and his cause. He desires a deeper righteousness. Let's not forget that at the heart of this sermon, what Jesus is calling for is a more in-depth, a deeper, a truer righteousness than what was being offered in the day from the scribes and the Pharisees. And so superficial religion is that which seeks the minimum and not the extra mile. Superficial religion is also that considers how what I do affects me and not other people. Now, later on in this sermon, Jesus is going to get down to what we often refer to as the golden rule, to treat others the way you want people to treat you. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. But Jesus does not wait till the end of the sermon to begin to talk to us about that. From the very beginning of the sermon, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 through verse 12, Jesus is talking about how our qualities, our God-approved qualities, include being merciful to others, being a peacemaker for others. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 16, Jesus is saying, hey, be salt and be light. Not for yourself, but to influence the world for Christ. Superficial religion is a religion that is not seeking to transform self, much less anyone else. You go throughout these contrasts, and Jesus is giving us some help, some guidance in how we treat our brother, and how we treat our spouse, and how we treat our coworker, how we treat our enemies, how we treat the world. And so Jesus is laying all this out there for us. It seems that our Lord is identifying the thought that there are so many, even in religious circles, whose religion is only skin deep. And so later, speaking to the same group, there's several teaching sections in Matthew, and a later one to this same group of people, that is the same kind of folks. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 7 and 8, he says, well did Isaiah prophesy concerning you, that this people draws near unto me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. Is that what rules our life? A religion that we put on and we take off with our Sunday best. A religion that is more concerned with seeming right to others than being right with God. Is it superficial religion? Now Jesus brings us to a second thought. What is the ruler? Who or what is the ruler of my life? Is my life ruled by superficial religion? A second thing for us to ask is my life ruled by what other people think? In Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 through 18, Jesus shifts his focus. He is telling his disciples that I want you to have a true righteousness. And so from this point to the end of the sermon, Jesus focuses on 6 areas of righteousness. It's righteousness with regard to our giving, and then righteousness as it comes to our prayer life. Righteousness as it regards our fasting, righteousness as it comes to money, righteousness regarding trust, and then righteousness with regard to judging other people. And so he says, as we approach all of these, you need to have the right kind of righteousness. You don't need to have a righteousness that is driven by what other people think. We care what other people think. But you know, something that Jesus is telling us is that kind of religion is a religion that's going to fall short. Remember, the kingdom of heaven is what is at stake here. Now, something that we should be warned about as we come to this part of the lesson, as we ask about this particular potential ruler, is that this idea of doing what we're doing to be seen of men is not something that I can easily detect in you. So often that's what we want to do. We find ourselves saying, I wonder if they are praying with the right kind of motivation. I wonder if their giving is just so other people will tell them how great they are. Oh, here they slipped up and said that they were fasting. I know what that means. Jesus is going in this very sermon to tell us that the people who operate from that kind of a mentality are those who have a religion of the scribes and the Pharisees. Jesus says in this very sermon that I want your works to be seen of men. But what he says is, I don't want that to be the motivation that drives you to do that. And so he deals with appearance-driven righteousness. Is that what rules our life? Doing what we do to be seen of others, to draw their praise and their admiration? Well, he tells us three things about this appearance-driven righteousness. That first of all, appearance-driven righteousness is done for the wrong reason. It is done for the reason of receiving the attaboys and the praise of men. And that's the wrong motivation. But he also tells us that it is done for the wrong reward. You go back to the reason for a moment. What was the reason why they were doing those things? The giving, the praying, and the fasting. It was to be seen of men. It was to be honored by men. It was to be praised by men. But Jesus says, if that's what you settle for, what an inferior reward that is. You are asking for the approval of people. People are fickle. People are hard to please. And there's not a person out there who died for you. There's not a person out there who knows you perfectly what's going on in your heart and in your life. And there's not a person out there who is going to judge you at the second coming. How terrible it is for us to make sure that this is why we're doing what we do. And Jesus says, what an inferior reward. In trying to do what you do to be seen of others, that's it. That's what you get. You get the fickle praise of men. I grew up reading Aesop's fables or having them read to me. I can't remember how it was I got them. But the one that sticks with me the most is the one about the man and his son and the donkey. You remember that one, right? And they were going on a journey, and everywhere they went, they came across somebody who had a criticism from village to village. They were criticized for the man riding the donkey and the boy walking, or the boy riding and the man walking. And then they both rode, and then neither of them rode. And at the end of the fable, they're both carrying the donkey. And the moral of the fable is, please all and you will please none. What an inferior thing to allow to rule our life. A reward that esoteric, a reward that unrewarding. But Jesus says it also ignores a valuable realization. If your life is ruled by the praise, by the appearance of what others think of your religion, you forget something that's more valuable. And that is, and it's said 3 times in this section, your Father sees. Instead of being worried about what people think, what they see, what Jesus says is, listen, your Father, He sees you do these things in secret, and He will reward you. And the text even says He will reward you openly. And who are we talking about? We're talking about the one who is able to do far more abundantly above all that we ask or think, Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20. Later on, Jesus is going to say in Matthew 10 and verse 28, do not fear him who is able to kill the body, but is not able to destroy the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. I don't want to miss the reward of my Father who's in heaven. But there's the other side of that. The Father who sees in secret, He is the one who's able to reward with eternal life and a home in heaven with Him. Jesus is laying it out there for us. He's saying, what is it that you are allowed to control your life? What are you giving control over to? Is it superficial, skin-deep religion that you take on and you take off with your Sunday best? Is it the appearance and the approval of others? But then he gets to another one. He says, is your life ruled by money and worry? In Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 through 34, Jesus deals with the longest subject that he's going to deal with in this sermon of sermons. And there are some who say that this is actually 2 subjects, that Jesus is dealing first with money in 19 through 24, and then he's dealing with worry in 25 through 34. But the worry is over material things. So I think Jesus is dealing with two aspects of the same subject. And he gives two prohibitive admonitions here. He says, do not, verse 19, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. And then in verse 25, he says, do not worry about your life. And in this, Jesus is saying that we should not allow things of this world to be what rules us and what grabs our life. I would recommend to you, you should go back and listen to the other audios. I was in room 11 this morning. Maybe some of you were as well. And there were two lessons back to back that dealt with the first part of this text, Matthew 6, 19 through 24. And I would encourage you to listen to Keith and Hiram's lesson as they dealt very well with this. But I want to talk about it for just a moment as it relates to who you let rule your life. Jesus says, are you letting money be that which rules your life? In verse 19 through 24. He warns that in verse 19 that we can make money the place where we make our greatest investment, and it becomes a distraction to us. In Proverbs 23, verse 4 and 5, Solomon talks about this idea of one who should not be concerned with getting wealth because it will leave them. It's like it will get on the wings of eagles into the heavens. He's saying, don't get embroiled in such a battle of letting that be what's number one in your life. He also, as he deals with that in verse 21, he says, it's possible for you to allow your investment of the things of this earth to be greater than your investment in heaven. Verse 21. Well, how do I know that? I may tell you one thing, but Jesus says, look, as God sees in secret, he is the one who knows the heart. Luke 16 and verse 15, in that context, is also talking about material things. And then in verse 22 and 23, he says our pursuit of money can lead us into darkness. As it talks about the eye is the light of the body, he's in the context of talking about money. And what he's saying is our desire, our attraction for things can consume us to such a point that we find ourselves in darkness. And really, that's what's being said in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9 and 10 by the Apostle Paul. He says, they who desire to be rich are going to fall into these various traps and these snares, these harmful and foolish desires that drown men in destruction and ruin. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, which while some have pursued after, they have wandered away from the faith, and they have pierced themselves through with many griefs. Jesus is saying this is what some of us struggle with. We allow this to become what rules our life, something that leads to that kind of an end. And in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, he says, money can be where your greater love is and where your greater loyalty is. And if it is, it's your master. But keep this in mind. We brought nothing into this world. And it is certain that we will carry nothing out. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 7. Or as Solomon would say, I came naked out of my mother's womb. I'm going to return naked at the end of this life. And what can I hold in my hands from all of this diligent labor that I did? Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 15. And so he says, don't let money be that which rules your life. And then he says, don't let worry over material things be that which rules your life. And as he walks through in verse 25 to verse 34, he tells us in verse 25 that worry over material provision, it limits our view of life to the physical, to the material. It lowers our own value of ourselves, verse 26 through 29. It lessens our faith, verse 30 through 32. And it also leaves us vulnerable to the future, verse 34. I love the little ditty that Joe Petty says, that worry never paid a bill. Worry never darned a heel. Worry never dried a tear. Worry never calmed a fear. Isn't it ironic that on the back of our currency, in God we trust, it's a saying on God's leading competitor. Yet we find ourselves so consumed by things of this life. Is God going to provide for me? Is everything going to be okay financially? What rules your life? Let me deal with one other thing. What rules your life? Is your life ruled by hypercriticism? In Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 through 6, Jesus, I think, hits even closer to home. When we look at what Jesus is showing us with regard to what fills our heart, what kind of righteousness do we really have? There was a woman who wanted to open up a banking account, and she went in, and as she sat across the desk from the banker, she noticed his name, and she thought, I went to school with a boy by that same name, but he was bald and he was wrinkled. And she was certain he was way older than the boy that she had to go to school with, and so she began to wonder if he had a son who went to school with her. And so she asked him, she said, Mister, did your son go to high school locally? And he said, no, ma'am. But I did. Valley High, class of 1963. She said, well, I was at Valley High in 63. He goes, is that right? I thought you looked familiar. What subject did you teach? Now, so often what happens is that we'll look at ourselves less realistically and less critically than we do others. But as Jesus rounds out to this idea of unrighteous judgment, he's saying, here's something that can rule your life. Here is a spirit that can consume you. You can find yourself being so critical of others. It's possible in the various contexts of life that we can find ourselves the belittler of the brotherhood. We can find ourselves being the policeman of the preacher, the Simon Cowell of the song leaders, or maybe the expert exposer of the elders. And it can be in every relationship. It can be at home. It can be at school. In every relationship. I was a child of the 70s. You may remember those guys. My favorite show, at least one of them, was The Muppet Show. And my favorite characters had to be Statler and Waldorf, named for two hotels in New York City. You remember those guys? They would sit up there in the balcony every week and they would talk about how terrible every joke was and every performance was, how terrible it was, but they were there week after week. And nobody thought that anybody was funnier than Statler than Waldorf did. And Waldorf thought nobody was funnier than Statler. And it seems to have been an exaggerated picture of the curmudgeon-y, crusty, critical people that we have all known. It was so exaggerated that it was funny. But it's not funny in the church. It's not funny for anybody who has to live with someone like that. Jesus deals with the hypercritical spirit. And as he does, he says this is something that can rule your life. It can get to the place in which you find yourself being so critical and so negative about everybody and everything, that is, except yourself. About a decade ago, Dick Meyer wrote a book entitled Why We Hate Us. And he created a term he called hyper-selfism. And he says this hyper-selfism is something that has been derived from this mentality that a self can be made or found. It's a product of postmodernism. And as he talks about hyper-selfism, he says one of the consequences of that is that it leads us to try to put down others in order to feel better about ourselves. And as a part of this aggrandizing of self and the putting down of others, he says it's what's led us to where we find ourselves, where individuals will say things in emails or texts they would never ever say to somebody in person. That one will make online comments that are full of hate and vitriol, because it's one never-ending game of king of the mountain where you suppress others and you put people down so that you can feel better than yourselves. But it's a terrible master in our lives. I cannot believe that the hypercritical person is happy or anything but miserable. Now, I want you to think for a few moments about these rulers of life. There's the person who's ruled by appearance. There's the person who is ruled by what other people think. There's the person who is ruled by worry and money. And there's the person who is ruled by a critical spirit. Every one of these possess a righteousness that is like the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And Jesus says, this ruler will prevent you from entering into the kingdom of heaven. I don't know a whole lot about anatomy and physiology, so you'll forgive me, but I think I'm right enough about this. That the cells of the body are such that there's a slot just the right size, chemically speaking, for oxygen to fit in that atom. It's how God's designed the circulatory system to work, the respiratory system to work. But the carbon monoxide molecule is frighteningly the same size and shape, and it fits nicely into that slot where oxygen belongs. And because of that, the frightening thing is that things seem normal. Even as a mass quantity of that CO2 coming into the body is suffocating the body, that everything seems normal. You're able to breathe in and out. The lungs are able to expand and contract, and you feel like everything is going normal, but you're asphyxiating. And ultimately, if you don't get out of that and aren't treated for that, you'll die. As Jesus lays all of these competitors alongside of himself, they frighteningly can fit into those same slots. They can seem like they're the right shape when it comes to religion, but they're deadly. And so Jesus says, don't let these things rule your life. As Jesus brings his great sermon to a close, he says all of these choices about who's going to be the ruler, who's going to be the master of your life, it really can be reduced down to two choices. Are you going to be ruled by the rock or the sand? Are you going to be ruled by the righteousness that comes from God or the righteousness that comes from yourself? Is it wisdom or folly? Is it standing or falling? You know, it seems that Jesus presents himself as not only the right, but an attractive alternative to these other choices of who we would let rule our lives. When you begin to walk down through that, I don't believe in checklist Christianity. But I do believe that what Jesus does is he says, if I'm the ruler of your life, let me give you some to-dos. Here's what that will look like. Takeaways, if you will. If you want to know what a life that's ruled by me looks like, it is one that causes you to do these God-approved things that lead to the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5, 1 through 12. Get out there and exert my influence in the world. Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 16. Do pray the way that I tell you. Matthew 6, verse 9 through 13. Do put the kingdom of heaven first. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. Do depend on me for everything that you need. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 through 11. Do walk the straight and narrow way. Matthew 7, verse 13 and 14. Do the will of my Father who is in heaven. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 through 23. And do the things that I teach you. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 and 25. You do these things and you won't stumble. You'll be standing on the rock of me. I'll have you notice with me, if you will, that he says, I say unto you 14 times in the course of this lesson. When he speaks of the kingdom of heaven, as has already been mentioned, he's talking about the reign and rule of God in your lives. He's saying, let me rule your life, and that's what will happen in your life. Jesus wants him to be the ruler of my life. But make no mistake about it, all of us have a master. Who is my master? Simply, my master is the one that I serve. And my master, and who I make master, is something that's visible. It's something that's measurable. What makes me angry? What makes me weep? What makes me laugh? That's my master. Look at my checkbook. Look at my clock. I was waiting for a later flight in Houston, Texas a few years ago. And at the same gate, there was a flight about to take off. And at 11 minutes to departure, there was a last call for Henderson and Hernandez, party of two. And at 10 minutes till the flight was to take off, they were then saying to two standby passengers that they could take the place of Henderson and Hernandez. Guess what happened at 9 minutes till? Here comes Henderson and Hernandez, a husband and wife, and they were informed that they had missed their flight and that that last call had come a minute before. I guess they had heard it as they were coming to the gate. You know, airline policy is actually 15 minutes, but they were being generous. But even with that, they missed it. And as they found out that they weren't going to be able to get on that flight, if you've ever missed a flight, it's a terrible feeling. There was anger, there was shock, there was upset, there were tears, there were profane things that were said. But the thing I remember most is she said, but I was only 1 minute late. You know, I've thought before, at the time of the coming of Christ, when the dead in Christ shall rise first, I wonder who will be the last person to consciously think, maybe not in these words, but in some way, who am I going to make the master of my life? Who will be the last one who was thinking, you know, am I going to make Jesus the Lord and the ruler of my life? I really should, and I'm going to at some point. In Philippians chapter 2, after giving us this great example of the selflessness of Jesus, and he humbled himself, and he became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 9 says, wherefore God has also highly exalted him and given him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow of things in heaven, things in earth, and things under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. One thing that Jesus never even makes a matter of question in this text is Jesus Lord? Because he is. And at the end, he is going to be acknowledged by all as Lord of all. Jesus' question has to do with this life. And that is Jesus my Lord? It's the choice that we all have to make. There are options, but there's only one right choice.